Hello, I'm Jeff Arnell, the Executive Director of Black Mountain College Museum and Art Center here in Asheville, North Carolina. Welcome to today's program. In the summer of 1944, a brave young woman from Georgia became the first African-American student to attend an all-white college in the Jim Crow South. Music student Alma Stone came to Black Mountain College for the 1944 Summer Music Institute, making history 10 years before Brown v. Board of Education mandated desegregation in schools across the United States. Alma was a recipient of a scholarship from the Julius Rosenwald Fund, entering her into a distinguished group that civil rights activist Julian Baum referred to as a who's who of Black America in the 1930s and 1940s. Other recipients included Augustus Savage, W.E.B. Du Bois, Maya Angelou, and Langston Hughes, among many others. After her remarkable summer at BMC, Alma received a second Rosenwald Fellowship as she pursued her advanced studies at Juilliard. She then returned to a long distinguished career as a college professor, as she and her husband Russell Williams also raised a family. At BMC, the successful experiment in integration led to more students and teachers of color joining the college community over the next few years. The Julius Rosenwald Foundation is pivotal to the history of progressive education in the United States. It highlights the role that education holds in greater social change. It is our privilege to host a conversation between award-winning photographer Andrew Feiler and Executive Director of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, Brent Leggs, on Feiler's newly published book of photographs and remembrances, A Better Life for Their Children, Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and the 4,978 Schools That Changed America. In today's program, Feiler will share the ongoing legacy of the Rosenwald Schools through his photographs. Following this presentation, Andrew Feiler and Brent Leggs will discuss the history of the Rosenwald Schools and the necessity of preservation for historic African-American sites.
Okay, so first of all, I just want to thank Brent Leggs for sharing the screen, this virtual stage with me. The work that he is doing at the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund is enormously important, incredibly timely, and there's no better leader to be leading that effort than Brent. He has been an extraordinary supporter of this project from the very beginning. There are 85 photographs in this body of work. And I think the first time I sat down with Brent to go through some of my early images, there were fewer than 20. That's how long he has been at the table with this project. And his afterward, as a contribution to this book, is this just beautiful piece around memory and history and place that is a really strong and lovely way to tie up this project. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to share my screen and walk you through some photographs and a little bit of the story of this project. The Rosenwald Schools are one of the most impactful and important initiatives in the first half of the 20th century in America. It transforms this nation, and it fundamentally transforms the African American experience. And yet, it remains hidden history. Few people know the scope and sweep and the magnitude of this program. And so what this project is about is using photography and art to bring more people into these stories. So I'll start with Julius Rosenwald. Julius Rosenwald was the son of Jewish immigrants who fled religious persecution in Germany. He grew up in Springfield, Illinois, across the street from Abraham Lincoln. And he rises to become the president of Sears, Roebuck and Company, which he led from 1908 until his death in 1932. He turns Sears into the world's largest retailer of its era. And he becomes one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history. And his cause is what is later known as civil rights. Booker T. Washington, born into slavery in Virginia, becomes one of the most prominent voices, African-American voices, in the late 19th and early 20th century. He becomes an educator, and he is the founding principal of the historically Black college in Alabama, known then as Tuskegee Institute. Now, the two men meet in 1911. Now, this is a rare photograph of the two of them together, printed on fabric and sewn into a quilt to commemorate the restoration of the Pine Grove Rosenwald School in Richland County, South Carolina. And at the rededication ceremony, former students and former teachers were invited to sign the quilt, and it hangs in the restored schoolhouse. So Washington and Rosenwald meet in 1911. You have to remember 1911 is before the Great Migration, which doesn't start until later that decade. So 90% of African Americans live in the South. But public schools for African Americans are mostly shacks, with a fraction of the funding provided to the education of white children. And many jurisdictions do not even have public schools for African Americans. So in 1912, they create the program that becomes known as Rosenwald Schools. It is one of the earliest collaborations between Blacks and Jews in the cause of civil rights. They reach out to the Black communities of the South, and they say, if you will contribute to a school, because we want you to be a full partner in your progress, and we will count as your contribution cash, land, labor, or material. And if you will reach out to the school board, the white school board, because we want to be deliberate in creating Black-white dialogue as a foundation for future progress, and we expect the white school board to agree to own, maintain, and staff the school, pay for the teachers, because these will be public schools. And if you do those two things, Julius Rosenwald will make a substantial contribution toward school construction. And from 1912, when ground is broken on what becomes the first Rosenwald School in the Lochapoka School in Lee County, Alabama, until 1937, when Franklin Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, dedicates the Eleanor Roosevelt School in Meriwether County, Georgia. 1912 to 1937, the program builds 4,978 schools across 15 states. And this program transforms America. There are two economists at the Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago who have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their data shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent Black-white education gap in the South. And that gap closes precipitously between World War I and World War II. And the primary driver of that achievement is Rosenwald schools. In addition, many of the leaders and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement come through these schools. Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, and Congressman John Lewis. Congressman Lewis attended a Rosenwald school in Pike County, Alabama, and he wrote this extraordinary introduction to my book, in which he talks not only about his first day in school, in this Rosenwald school, but he talks about his passion for education, to use his word, as the cornerstone of democracy. So I first heard about Rosenwald schools from a woman named Jeannie Syriac, who originated the role of African-American heritage specialist at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office. The story shocked me. I am a 5th-generation Jewish Georgian. I have been a progressive activist my entire life. And the pillars of this story, Southern, Jewish, progressive, activist, they're the pillars of my life. I was like, how could I have never heard of this story? So I came home that day from lunch and I Googled Rosenwald schools. And what I found was that there are several books on the topic, but there had not been a comprehensive photo documentary of the Rosenwald Schools program. And so I set out to do exactly that. So the original 4,978 schools, about 500 remain. And over 3.5 years, I drove 25,000 miles through all 15 program states and shot 105 of the surviving schools. This is the Emory School, likely the oldest surviving Rosenwald school, built in Hale County, Alabama in 1915. And it is what is known as a one-teacher school. I also found 2 teacher schools. This is a Noble Hill School in North Georgia. 3 teacher schools, the Pleasant Plains School in Eastern North Carolina. And by the end, notice that those are all small white clapboard structures. By the time you get to the end of the program, they're building 1, 2, and 3-story brick buildings. Now, of the surviving 500 schools, only about half have been restored. And of the other half, only a handful are still in use as educational spaces. This is the Dunbar School in Pulaski County, Arkansas. This is Little Rock. And this school is now a magnet middle school, but significantly, several students from Dunbar were among those who walked into history and integrated Little Rock High School as the Little Rock 9. And in the context of that story, if this building looks familiar with its Art Deco details, it's because the architect of Little Rock Central High School was also the architect of the Dunbar School. So there's only a handful of these schools that are still in use as educational spaces, but there is a wide range of adaptive reuses. Some are community centers. These are the Pleasant Hill Quilters, who quilted to raise money to restore the Pleasant Hill Rosenwald School in Cass County, Texas, and now meet in the schoolhouse on Mondays to quilt. Others have been turned into church halls. They were often built adjoining churches because the churches helped fund the land or helped donate the land. Some have become museums. This is the Warfield School in Montgomery County, Tennessee. But many remain unrestored and at risk of deterioration and collapse. And we risk the loss of these precious historic resources and the stories that they hold. So an important component of this work is the plea for preservation so that we can keep these memories and these stories and this essential history alive. And indeed, there were times when I came across schools that had collapsed so recently that they were surrounded by caution fencing or security fencing, or in this case, the Du Bois School in Wake County, which was surrounded by yellow caution tape and had been demolished because it was unsafe a week before I arrived. But the heart of this story was the people. I met former students like Frank and Charles Brinkley at the Cairo School in Sumter County, Tennessee. Former teachers, Ellie Damer and Kelly Settlement at the Bay Springs School. And I want to tell a deeper story about the Hopewell School, because this connects a lot of important dots in the narrative. This is in Bastrop County, Texas. So in the center of this image is a portrait from the 19th century. That is Martin and Sophia McDonald. They were both born into slavery. And upon emancipation, Martin begins to raise farm animals. He acquires some land. He acquires more land. And he eventually accumulates 1,200 acres. And when the Rosenwald Schools program comes to Bastrop County, Texas in 1919, the family donates 2 acres of land for the school. The first teacher is Martin and Sophia's daughter. One of her first students is her daughter, Sophia Williams, shown here on the right, holding up the portrait of her grandparents. Her husband on the left, Elroy Williams, went to a different Rosenwald School in Bastrop County. They both go off to college. They become educators back in Bastrop County, and now they are leading the restoration of this school. Students becoming teachers, becoming the keepers of the flame of history and memory and preservation. So I just want to, I came across so many extraordinary stories just like that it became imperative that I share not just these images, but the stories that come with them. And so each image in this project comes with a short story that tell the Rosenwald School's connections to the Tuskegee Airmen, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, the Great Migration, the Trail of Tears, murder, embezzlement. And so I hope that you will spend time not just with these images, spend time with these stories as well, because I think you'll find them inspiring, and I think that they'll you'll find that they make you a little more optimistic about the possibility of change in America. I think the heart of this story to me is this concept of a better life for their children. Julius Rosenwald was looking for a better life for his children. Booker T. Washington was looking for a better life for his children. The African-American families that raised the money and built these schools were seeking a better life for their children. And together with that vision, they made America a better place. And I think the heart of this story is a simple notion. Individual actions, in fact, make a difference. They can change the nation, they can change the world. And I reflect on one of the things that Congressman Lewis said in his introduction to this book, that each of us has an obligation and a mandate that when we see something that is not right or not just, we have to find a way to get in the way. And so I close this part of our discussion by remembering one of the most telling things that Congressman Lewis said, and that is, may we all find our way to make good trouble. So with that, let me invite Brent back into the conversation. And I'm going to start with the portrait of Brent that accompanies his afterward in this book. Brent, tell us about this picture and its location and its role in its connections to your story and your life.
Well, first, Andrew, I just want to say thank you for delivering such an eloquent and beautiful presentation, and congratulations on your book. This is the first time I've seen this photo. So I'm sitting here being connected back to that moment, and I'm holding this umbrella because it was raining. But it was the first time that I stood on the same landscape that my dad walked to a Rosenwald School on. And I was intentional about selecting this site because I wanted to convey what we lose when Rosenwald Schools or Black history in its physical form is lost, and the impact of erasure. But as I stood there in the rain on that soggy ground, I felt this deep sense of connection to place, to my family's legacy and identity. And I felt this through line, that there was a continuity of history, even in the face of erasure. And that was because Booker T. Washington's vision for uplifting the Black community was real and ongoing and had directly impacted my own life through my parents attending Rosenwald Schools. I've communicated this so many different times in speeches and keynotes, but to literally live those words in this moment. So I extend my gratitude to be included in such an important piece of literature and beauty.
Thank you. I will stop sharing screen now. It's been great to have you part of this project, and I didn't realize this the first time you've seen the picture.
First time, yeah.
Wow. So you talk to us about how you came to the Rosenwald School story and how you came to preservation, because as I understand, those were richly connected.
Yeah, so the Rosenwald Schools connection is really the starting point for me in historic preservation. So the short story is I got an undergrad in marketing, I got an MBA, and I graduated, and I was fast tracking the MBA, studying full time. And so I graduated and I hadn't searched for a job. And I started to wonder whether or not corporate America was a good fit for my personality. I made a decision that it wasn't. I wanted something that had a stronger kind of social mission. And I started to research. I thought I'd get a PhD in history. I thought about a PhD in philosophy and realized I needed to speak fluent second language, and I scrapped that idea. And I thought I discovered it. which was a furniture making class in the School of Architecture at the University of Kentucky. And when I went inside to learn more, I met Dr. Dennis Domer, who was the dean of the graduate preservation program. And this unintentional random conversation would literally, after 15 minutes, that I made the decision to enter the preservation program at UGA. I was the first African-American, first person with an MBA. And when he told me I could make a shitload of money using federal tax credits and kind of historic redevelopment, I was sold. And then I got into the program and I was learning about architectural history and iconic and Gothic columns. And I was really questioning whether or not I made the right decision. And thankfully, they introduced me to Rosenwald Schools. And I had the good fortune to conduct a statewide inventory of historic Rosenwald schools in my home state of Kentucky. And
at that point, did you know that your parents had been to Rosenwald Schools, or did that only come during your research?
That only came through my research. Yeah, so you can imagine, only thing that I knew about Booker T. Washington, I read his autobiography, Up From Slavery. My mind was blown knowing that a man was formerly enslaved would establish a new educational center known as Tuskegee Institute, and the accomplishment of such an ambitious dream and vision. Like, he was a legend in my mind, but to then discover that he would partner with Julius Rosenwald to create a social movement in response to a crisis in Black education, and then to learn that there was a family personal connection, it shifted my whole understanding of the power of preservation.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because I'm going to go back to the story that the last photograph that I shared prior to yours. The Williams, Elroy and Sophia Williams, both went to Rosenwald Schools. They didn't know that they were Rosenwald Schools.
Yeah.
Well, Elroy was in college and he was an athlete, and he went to a track meet at Tuskegee, and it was at Tuskegee that he heard for the first time what this program was all about.
Awesome.
That's what caused him to be a preservationist. He came back, and when as a teacher in Bastrop County, started to try to preserve this school and learn about historic preservation, and he got involved with other preservation projects to learn how done. And he has these incredible stories about putting tin on the roof to try to save the roof. You know, as a preservationist,
oh yeah,
a lot if you save the roof, but if you lose the roof, you're dead.
Right.
And the winds kept blowing the tin off the roof. But yeah, same thing. He was not aware that of the history of these schools until much later.
Yeah, that's what I think is powerful about what you're doing, what we do as preservation practitioners, is it helps to reveal these overlooked stories. I mean, there's so much imbued beauty in understanding that more than 100 years ago, a multiracial community of activists, Booker T. Washington, Julius Rosenwald, Black and white local communities, more than 4,000, almost 5,000, would come together around a shared vision to uplift the Black community through education and through the highest quality of architecture and education.
Yes.
Like, how can we not follow the blueprint that's already developed and proven to have a positive social impact in our communities today?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, you make a good point, which is an important point, which was this program started with a progressive era vision of architecture in service to education. The design of these schools is very deliberately designed to enhance education.
Yes.
Those to let light in, cloakrooms so that outer garments that will not sully the classrooms, that the dirt can be kept in the cloakrooms.
That's it.
Et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of that in this program.
It is. It really is a story that links together architecture and racial justice.
Yes.
but through your work, I think there are additional layers, which for me is beauty. The power of photography to communicate a story and to do that through this lens of beauty. Even that example of the historic school that looks like it was demolished or collapsed days before you arrived, and it's a ruin. And how there was some beauty in just the physical material culture still existing to say history happened here. And so I'm curious, like, tell me more about your creative spirit and why you connect your art to culture and to historic places.
So I think that several threads came together. I have been a serious photographer most of my life, but starting in 2008, I went through 4.5 very difficult years that included my brother having a serious life-threatening illness, death of a business partner, my father's health collapsing. And at the time I was managing a family real estate business. So we went into the teeth of the Great Recession, and I spent 3 years and 4 months doing real estate workouts. And collectively, those are the kinds of things that cause you to say, what do you want to do the rest of your life?
Mm-hmm.
And so I started down this path of taking my photography more seriously, and graciously, fortunately, being taken more seriously. But I had to find my voice as a photographer. Well, I've also been a progressive activist my whole life. I have founded 12 community initiatives. I've served on the boards of a number of not-for-profits. I'm very involved with folks who are running for office and in office, engaged in public policy issues. And so as I thought through my voice as an artist, inherently it went back to my civic values. So the first book, which came out in 2015, was about the central role that education has played as the backbone of the American dream. And I trace it from the first publicly funded school in America, which predates the United States of America, 1644, all the way to Brown v. Board, to the debates we're having today around college affordability and college access, and how that American dream is a dream at risk. So this project picks up on those threads. This project is at some level about the central role that education plays in our democracy. Education is that on-ramp to the American middle class for African Americans and all Americans. And yet it is also about a white Jewish Northern businessman and a Black Southern Christian educator reaching across divides of race and region and religion, and coming together and changing the nation in an incredibly affirming and positive way.
I think that is so beautiful, and that's why I'm delighted that there's a local and national coalition of preservation is working to create the first national park in recognition of Julius Rosenwald and the Rosenwald Schools story. And when I say first national park, it will be the first unit of our national park system to honor a Jewish American and their contributions.
Yeah, and I was recently invited to serve on the advisory board, and I'm honored to be part of that process.
Yeah.
But speaking of new initiatives, though, tell us about the initiative that you run, and because the American story, the American preservation narrative, has not been diverse. It has been incomplete, and you're on a mission to ensure that the history that we tell is a more inclusive and complete history. Talk to us about that.
That's exactly it. So the mission really is to redefine a new American culture and narrative, to fill gaps in American history. And my passion is using historic places as tools. So historic places, landscapes, stories, to begin the process of reconstructing our national identity. So I have the good fortune of running and being the founding executive director of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And it was created in the aftermath of Charlottesville. I know that we both can remember the tragic events that happened there. And this was one of these moments that was a cultural reckoning. And it forced the profession of historic preservation, because preservation was part of a national discourse, and this intersection between heritage, historic preservation, and social conflict. And we brainstormed and understood that we had a leadership role to help not resolve, but to begin the process of mitigating some of the social crises that we witnessed. And we believe deeply that those events did not express our cultural and national values. And for me, it was an example of the miseducation of Americans. So how could we use place, stories, race, and identity to confront that miseducation? And I'm proud to say that in just 3 years, we've raised $25 million, invested in 150 Black communities and preservation projects. And we've done this with a new coalition of preservationists that I like to call social justice leaders, like Darren Walker, who is the president of the Ford Foundation, actor and director, Miss Felicia Rashad, Elizabeth Alexander and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, Barbara Dana Borland of the JPB Foundation, and others. It's a revolution in the U.S. preservation movement, and it's setting a blueprint for the other social and ethnic communities to follow.
Wow. So you, I'm sure in the course of that work, you've come across some, just like I had never heard of Rosenwald Schools, I'm sure you've come across a story that just shocked you and that surprised you. And now that you will have had the opportunity to help preserve that story, share a story with us.
There's so many stories that I would have never learned about unless I was involved in preservation. I would say a story that just kind of opened my eyes to the gold mine of overlooked stories was that about Pauli Murray in Durham, North Carolina. I had never heard of Pauli Murray, but to come to find out, she was the first African-American Episcopal saint. She was a co-founder of the National Organization of Women. She was a civil rights lawyer, and Thurgood Marshall referred to her legal research as the Bible of civil rights law. That Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg dedicated her first U.S. Supreme briefing in the memory and honor of Pauli Murray. That Pauli Murray coined the term Jane Crow. And I'm like, how in the world did I grow up to become an adult and not know about Pauli Murray? And, there's so many other examples that, it really reflects how the inequity within preservation practice, the inequity across the American cultural landscape has existed as a mirror to our social values. We have preserved places to tell stories associated to a privileged few, mainly white men. And it's exciting today to be part of a broader effort and movement to tell a more inclusive story that reflects the contributions of African Americans and BIPOC communities.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a new documentary out about Pauli Murray that just came out.
It is. I hadn't seen it yet, but I hear it's pretty fantastic.
Right. Yeah, I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's on my list.
Well, I'm curious. So do you consider yourself a preservationist? Do you use your photography, your love of American history, your quest to rediscover American history? And is that historic preservation? Are you a preservationist?
I'm absolutely a preservationist. First of all, I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, in some degree, birthplace of the historic restoration movement in America. The historic restoration movement in Savannah begins in the 1950s when a developer had planned to tear down an historic home known as the Davenport House. My family's office has since 1962 been next door to the Davenport House, which is now an historic home open to the public. There's actually a picture of my parents breaking ground with a shovel, and I'm like 1 year old in my mother's arms. And connect the dots from that to the fact that however many years later, my wife and I live in an historic building. When we purchased it, it was falling apart. In fact, the building inspector did us a great service by telling us that the roof was in such bad shape, it looked like a fat lady after liposuction. That allowed us to renegotiate the price a little bit. But we went through a very elaborate process and found, as she said to me, in the South, you don't know whether you're going to be dealt a saint or a sinner when you scratch below the surface. And we turned out and dealt a saint. As you well know, there was this institution in America in the South known as convict leasing. Trumped up charges on poor African Americans were created, and these folks were essentially re-enslaved and leased out. And one of the worst offenders of that was the brick industry. And we live in an historic building that we refurbished that was the office of Benjamin Mifflin Hood.
Wow.
Was the leading reformer in the South, and who led the charge in Georgia to overturn the convict leasing system, which he successfully did in 1908, getting first the city of Atlanta to ban the purchase of brick from companies that used convict leasing, and then ultimately the state legislature to ban convict leasing in Georgia. So history is important to me. I have a graduate degree in history. I think those stories are an important part of understanding today, and how we think about our problems today, how we think about solving those problems can be an understanding of history. In this particular narrative, it's not just history, but it is preservation, because we race against time to save these structures and capture these stories. Look, I'm incredibly unfortunate at the timing of this project, because there are a couple of group portraits in this book. And when you add up, there's some group portraits. There's 47 people whose portrait appears in this book. 3 of them have already died.
Wow.
And I'll tell you, one of them is Mildred Estelle Ridgely Gray, who was a student at the Ridgely School in Prince George's County, Maryland. Went to college, came back, was a teacher in the school, found that she had a passion for special needs, goes off to NYU, gets a graduate degree in special needs, comes back. The school is now integrated. It is a specialty school for special needs, and she becomes a principal. And I did her portrait in this school when she was 98 years old. And a year later, her daughter called me up and said that her mother had passed away, and could they please use the photograph in the funeral program? Which
my goodness.
I'm absolutely honored to be part of. Her photograph is in the book.
Oh, that almost brought a tear to my eye. And it's beautiful, because that is such a powerful story of resilience and accomplishment and achievement, and how this book helps to memorialize her name, her story, her experience.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly right. So where do you want to, you've gotten this fund off the ground, it's only been a few years. What are some of the higher mountains in your view?
I think very ambitiously, but I think, just to give you one example, so currently our National Register of Historic Places, which is the national inventory of places included in that inventory that's worthy of preservation, only 2% directly reflects the Black experience.
Which is that number is more than shocking. That number is there's just this negligence, there is ignorance. I mean, that is just a horrific statistic.
It's that mirror that I mentioned earlier about reflecting back our social and cultural values. And so it really represents who we are as a nation, which is we are culturally a society of inequity. And I think we have the opportunity in this moment to begin to seriously catch up and fill in the gaps. So I would love to be able to list, let's say, 5,000 places in the National Register that reflects the Black experience. I'd love to be able to create a sophisticated real estate development strategy that is anchored in culture and historic redevelopment to help revitalize and create a rebirth in historic African American commercial and residential corridors, and to attract significant investment to make that happen. And then I think for myself, the bigger dream is how to empower Black communities and Black people and our allies, but in particular, Black people and communities, to demonstrate their exceptional stewardship capacity and potential to care for this history.
Mm-hmm.
And if that is achieved through various different programs and investment mechanisms, that will have tremendous long-term impact.
Well, I can't help it connect the dots, excuse me, between what you just said, engagement of the Black community in this mission, with the Julius Rosenwald Booker T. Washington model, which was, where the engagement of the African American community in their own work and their own progress was a hugely important part of the model.
It is. There is no way, I think, for us to shift preservation practice without inclusion and equity being, the new heartbeat for preservation practice. And what I've been most pleased about is that how the Action Fund has shifted the organizational culture at the National Trust, that is shifting a culture at the state and local level. And so I believe that we are in a moment of revolution and transformation. And I think the greatest excitement, both in your book and all of the other ways that artists are contributing to the movement, is helping the general public understand the multi-layered ways that we can contribute to the preservation and diversity of American culture.
Your fund, so we have this diversity problem in preservation. Your fund is focused on the African American narrative. Are there other initiatives within the National Trust, or is your mission perhaps going to expand to include the stories of Asian Americans, LGBTQ Americans, Jewish Americans, Muslim Americans? I mean, there's a lot of diversity missing in the diversity narrative here.
That is true. And so we have conversations and we go back and forth. BIPOC, I think, is a way that we can be more inclusive, but I personally am mindful that not enough resources have been invested in the preservation of African American historic places in American history, and that there is a lot of need, underutilized historic buildings, abandoned, vacant. And I'll give you just one statistic. So through our national grant program, over the last 4 grant rounds, we've requested proposals. We've received almost 2,300 proposals requesting almost $250 million.
Wow.
That's just proposals that are eligible based on our 4 grant categories. It's not expressing what the full financial need is for the stewardship of these places, which is billions of dollars. Even our national parks have deferred maintenance of 13+ billion. So my concern is not spreading this very limited amount of funding too wide, because I want to make sure that we go deeper in our investment and engagement to use African American historic places as sites of innovation that will inform the broader and future preservation work.
Mm-hmm. But there's something incredibly exciting about the fact that each of those proposals, though you can't remotely fund all of, even a small fraction of them, represents a group of leaders in the community that have identified a location that's historical significance and worthy of preservation. And that there's something to incredibly celebrate in that grassroots initiative and understanding of the importance of preservation in history.
That's exactly it. And so I'm pleased that because of the success of the Action Fund, we've created a new program. It's called Where Women Made History. And we launched this last year. We did crowdsourcing campaign and have populated a map and a collection of more than 1,000 places where American women have made a difference in history. And I hope that we can continue to build on that and continue to build on our own engagement to preserve landscapes associated to Native American history or civil rights sites associated to the Latino American story, or places like historic Williamsburg that's in LA that represents the Japanese American experience. There are so many places and grassroots communities that's waiting for support.
Right.
Yeah. So I want to kind of end with something that I think it's in the words of Booker T. Washington and feels very much appropriate to our conversation and the significance of Rosenwald Schools. And Booker T. Washington once said, "I had the feeling that to get into a schoolhouse and study in this way would be about the same as getting into paradise."
That speaks to the heart of the heart of this idea that education is the backbone of the American dream. This concept of American dream has changed over time. It is changing now, but from the very beginning, from 1644, when the first publicly funded school was created, all the way through to the Land Grant College Act in the 1860s, to the historically Black colleges that are mostly founded in the decades after the Civil War, to Rosenwald Schools, to the educational provisions of the GI Bill, to Brown v. Board, to where we are today. But I'm going to go back. That just reminds me, though, of one of the more inspiring stories that I heard in the course of this work. And it's a story of what happened right after emancipation. And the first schools were opened for African Americans. And there are these incredible stories of all of these people showing up at the schools, walking for miles, young people, old people, because there was such a broad craving for knowledge and such a broad understanding that the path forward led through education. And so I think that's what the words that you just summarized there from Booker T. Washington encapsulate it beautifully. And it's a story, this is the history that you and I have the great privilege of working on and sharing. And it has been a joy to work on this project with you. And I look forward to working on other projects with you as we get to go forward.
Likewise, Andrew, and thank you for recording what Booker T. Washington called a paradise.
Thank you.
And I cannot wait to read and to see each page in a better light for their children.
Great to be with you, Brent.
You too.
Thank you.